Chapter 4. The Logical Elimination of the Infinite Regress. Pillar 3, 4.1. Something can't come from absolute nothing, but I'm pretty sure the guy who just flipped me off is real. In this chapter, we will demonstrate that an infinite regress is not just impractical, it is logically incoherent and metaphysically impossible. Any system that permits an endless chain of causes or justifications ultimately collapses into absurdity, never arriving at a stable foundation. To simply reject infinite regress as undesirable is not enough. We must establish why it is impossible and what necessarily replaces it as a foundation of reality. The logical elimination of infinite regress is not an isolated conjecture, but the inevitable consequence of the other pillars, the epistemic refutation paradox, ERP, the persistent present, PP, and the illusion of nothingness, ion. Together, these pillars show that an infinite regress of explanations or causes is not merely unlikely or impractical. It is a metaphysical non-starter. In other words, any valid explanatory system must terminate in something self-sufficient and necessary. In other words, any valid explanatory system must terminate in something self-sufficient and necessary. At this point, it can sound like I am doing exactly what I will later accuse others of doing, picking a stopping point and stamping it necessary by fiat. That would be the classic brute fact move. And if that were all existential logicism were doing, the whole project would collapse into the same, it just is, that we are criticizing. It is worth being explicit about the difference. By a brute fact, I mean a stopping point whose only real justification is this is where we decide to stop asking why. Nothing in the structure of reality forces that choice. We simply refuse to look any deeper. What logical elimination of infinite regress is doing is the opposite. Starting from the earlier pillars. Earp's constraint, that you cannot even raise questions without already being inside reality. Ion's ban on absolute nothingness, and the persistent presence demand that dependence be fully realized in the present. We systematically rule out all the ways explanation could fail, pure all the way down chains, purely circular dependence, and regress into a metaphysical void. Once those options are off the table, some self-grounding structure is not a free extra assumption. It is what is left over when the incoherent alternatives have been eliminated. When I talk about a self-sufficient and necessary foundation, I am naming that residue, not sneaking in a new mystery object. Later, in section 4.8.1, I will return to this under the heading Why Not Just Accept Brute Facts, and argue directly that the brute fact move is precisely the refusal to do this elimination work. We will explore each of these three insights in turn, and then address major objections before articulating the profound implications of this conclusion. 4.2 ERP and Lear, the limits of knowledge. ERP established that all reasoning and knowledge ultimately depend on self-evident truths or necessary principles. In epistemology, this is known as the regress problem. Every belief or claim would require another belief as justification, and that one would require another, and so on ad infinitum. If an infinite regress of justification were possible, a view some epistemologists call infinitism, genuine knowledge could never get off the ground. Every justification would forever defer to a prior justification, and nothing would ever be truly justified. In practical terms, if every reason needs another reason to support it, we would be stuck in an eternal chain of why. Questions with no final answer. This is clearly a vicious regress. It fails to resolve the very problem, grounding knowledge, that it sets out to solve. Since we do have knowledge, infinite justification chains cannot be the whole story. At some point, the chain of reasons must terminate in something foundational. In classical terms, this is often handled by foundationalism, which posits that there are basic beliefs or self-justifying truths that require no further support. ERP confirms that without at least one self-evident starting point, the entire edifice of knowledge collapses. Thus, knowledge cannot exist within an infinite sequence of unsupported inferences. It needs a starting point that does not itself demand justification. That starting point cannot be arbitrary or contingent, or else it would beg the question, why that point? And the regress would sneak in again at a deeper level. Instead, the foundation of knowledge must be a necessary truth, something that is true by its very nature and justifies itself. In the context of our inquiry, ERP revealed that the existential logicism, undeniability of immediate experience, serves as such a starting point. A truth, for example, experience is occurring, that cannot be coherently doubted and does not rely on a prior proof. More generally, ERP teaches us that any knowable system of thought requires a terminus of justification, a self-grounded principle. Without it, the concept of truth or knowledge would evaporate into an infinite mire of uncertainty. The lesson of ERP is clear. An infinite regress of reasons is impossible if we are to avoid total epistemic nihilism. Some truths must stand firm on their own necessity for anything else to be known. 4.3 The persistent present, eliminating infinite causal chains. The persistent present, PPE, argument shows that time and causality, much like knowledge, cannot sustain an infinite regress. We normally think of time as a succession of moments stretching into the past and future, but PP embraces presentism, the view that only the present moment truly exists. Every moment we encounter is the now, continuously renewed. Past moments have happened and are gone. Future moments are yet to be and have no reality now. If an infinite regress of causes were true, the present moment could never be reached. It would be eternally trapped behind an infinite sequence of prior events that had to happen first. To illustrate this, philosophers often use the analogy of counting down from negative infinity. If the universe had an infinite past, it would be like someone attempting to finish counting an infinite series of negative numbers in order to reach zero, the present. They would never succeed, because no matter how far back they start, an infinity of numbers would still precede any given point. If the past were truly infinite, today would never arrive. The countdown of all prior events would never conclude. And yet, the present has arrived. We are here, now, experiencing this moment. This undeniable fact refutes the notion of an infinite temporal regress in causation. The chain of events leading to the present cannot extend endlessly backward. It must have a fundamental resolution point, or a first cause, or condition that allows the sequence to start and proceed. Historically, this is one insight behind the cosmological argument for a first cause. Importantly, PP refines this insight by noting that the resolution point need not be a first moment in time, in the classical sense, some initial tick of the cosmic clock. Rather, what is required is a necessary principle or state that enables each moment to be realized. In other words, instead of a temporal, beginning out of nothing, there must be an underlying equilibrium or creative principle that is eternally present and continuously gives rise to each new moment. Such a principle would ensure that time can unfold without an infinite delay. This means physical reality doesn't require a prior event, before all others, which just raises the question of what came before the first. It requires a fundamental ground of being, or self-sufficient cause, that operates continually to sustain the sequence of events. The persistent present thereby eliminates the need for an infinite causal chain. The existence of this present moment indicates that the causal sequence resolves in something that exists outside the sequence, a necessity that is always present to guarantee that each new event can happen. In sum, an infinite regress of causes is incompatible with the reality of now. There must be a causally self-contained source that allows the succession of moments to commence and continue. Without such a source, time itself would be stuck in an unreachable past, and the fact of the present would be inexplicable. 4.4. The illusion of nothingness, why an absolute void cannot exist. The illusion of nothingness, ion, reveals that the very concept of nothingness is incoherent as a state of reality. Philosophers have long asked, why is there something rather than nothing? A question that presumes nothing is a possible default. Ion dismantles that assumption by showing that nothing is not an ontological alternative at all, but merely a placeholder concept in language and thought. We use the word nothing to denote the absence of specific things. For example, there is nothing in the box, meaning no object is present. But we are easily misled into treating nothingness as a kind of background reality. In truth, absolute nothingness cannot exist. It is a logical contradiction. To even speak of nothing is to refer to something, even if only an idea. Thus, the notion of a state in which there is utterly nothing, no space, no laws, no existence whatsoever, is an illusion born of grammar and imagination. As Parmenides, 1984, observed over 2 millennia ago, non-being is literally unspeakable. You cannot know what is not, nor utter it. Likewise, the poet Victor Hugo, Hugo 1862, put it succinctly, there is no such thing as nothingness. Nothing is nothing. In short, nothingness has no ontological legs to stand on. What does this mean for infinite regress? If an infinite regress of explanations or causes were true, it would imply that existence has no ultimate ground, that it's turtles all the way down, with no fundamental entity at the bottom. Carried to its logical end, this suggests that being could dissolve into non-being, that if we chased the chain of dependency forever, we might end up with no cause at all, effectively something arising from nothing. But Ion has shown that nothing is not a valid terminus. Nothingness cannot be the origin of something, not because of a causal prejudice, but because nothingness isn't actually a state that could obtain. Therefore, there never was a state of absolute nothingness in reality. Existence in some form is eternal. We are forced to conclude that something has always existed. However, this eternal something cannot itself be dependent on prior causes, since that would just push the regress back one step. Whatever has always existed must exist by its own nature, requiring no external cause. It must be self-sustaining, self-resolving, and necessary. Ion thus complements the previous arguments. It tells us that the chain of explanation cannot terminate in a void or an arbitrary stop. There is no option of and then nothing, and that's why something exists. That is nonsense. The only way to end an explanatory regress is in a necessary being or principle that cannot not exist. In metaphysical terms, this is a being whose essence includes existence itself, or a truth that is unavoidably the case. Nothingness, being impossible, cannot be where a regress lands. The regress must end in being, specifically, in necessary being. 4.5 Why infinite regress is impossible, and what must replace it. Taken together, ERP, PP, and ion paint a coherent picture. Infinite regress, whether in reasoning, causation, or existential origins, cannot be the structure of reality. Rejecting infinite regress is not a mere preference, but a logical necessity. We cannot ground knowledge, causality, or existence upon an infinite chain of dependencies without collapsing the very concepts of knowledge, causality, or existence. Each of the three pillars independently forced us to recognize a terminus, a self-justifying truth in the case of knowledge, a first cause or ever-present source in the case of time, and a necessary being in the case of existence. These conclusions all point to the same idea. Reality must have a necessary, self-existent foundation that does not require anything prior to it. In fact, it would be contradictory to suppose otherwise. If we tried to imagine any domain in which explanations trail off into an infinite regress, we find the domain becomes unintelligible or outright contradictory. Thus, infinite regress is not just untenable, it is impossible in a coherent worldview. The only logically valid solution is that the buck stops at something fundamental that explains itself. Our task now is to confront a few major objections to this line of reasoning in order to see whether rejecting infinite regress is truly unavoidable. 4.6% confronting objections: is an infinite regress just reality? Even faced with the above arguments, some will object that perhaps an infinite regress is simply how reality is, bizarre and paradoxical as it may seem. Others propose clever workarounds, like circular causation or brute facts, in an effort to avoid positing a fundamental foundation. Let us address and dismantle the three most common objections. 4.7% Objection 1. An infinite regress just is the nature of reality. According to this objection, an endless chain of causes or justifications is not a flaw in our explanations, but an inherent feature of existence. On this view, there is no need for a final stopping point or ultimate ground. Reality just is an infinite cascade of dependencies stretching infinitely into the past, or downwards in explanation. Instead of seeking a terminator to the chain, this perspective urges us to embrace the regress as the true structure of the world, however counterintuitive it may be. For example, a radical epistemic infinitist might claim that beliefs can be justified by an infinite series of other beliefs with no foundational belief, or a cosmologist might speculate that time extends eternally backward with no beginning. Why not, they ask, simply accept an infinite regress as brute truth? The answer is that this solution is no solution at all. It is an admission of failure to explain. To say it's just infinite all the way, no further justification needed, is to abandon the very aim of reasoning, which is to increase understanding. What does it mean to claim reality as nothing more than an endless chain of unanswered whys? If no fact or event can ever be fully explained or grounded, because there's always another layer beneath, then in a profound sense, nothing is ever explained at all. This stance undermines the possibility of knowledge and understanding. It leaves us in a paradoxical position. If every belief or fact relies on a prior one ad infinitum, then no belief can ever be validated or known for certain. The entire enterprise of knowledge would be like a mirage. Each time you reach for a justification, it slips further out of reach. In accepting an infinite regress, we would be accepting that we can never actually know anything. Every answer is just a deferred question. As one analysis of the regress problem puts it, an infinite regress of this sort renders a theory self-defeating, because it fails to solve the problem it was meant to solve. Knowledge would be impossible in principle, as it would require completing an infinite justification process. This contradicts the fact that we do have some knowledge, even if only of our own immediate experience. Therefore, by reductio ad absurdum, infinite epistemic regress cannot reflect reality. If it did, the very concept of truth or justified belief would implode. We would be trapped in total skepticism, never able to claim any knowledge as established. 4.8 Objection 2. What if the universe is an infinite causal loop? A different escape attempt is to replace a linear infinite regress with a circular loop. Rather than a caused by B, B by C, and so on forever, one might suggest that perhaps a causes B causes C, and C causes A, closing the chain into a self-contained cycle. This way, the universe, or some aspect of it, might have no ultimate beginning, yet also avoids an infinite linear regress. It loops back onto itself. Such a model is sometimes entertained in cosmology, a universe that recycles itself eternally, or in certain philosophical views of time, closed time curves, and might be seen as akin to coherentism in epistemology. Beliefs mutually support each other in a web, with no linear hierarchy. On the face of it, this idea of a causally closed loop or self-referential system sounds elegant. It seems to offer a way for the universe to be its own cause without invoking anything beyond the system. Are causal loops a viable alternative to an infinite regress? Closer analysis shows that a causal loop is merely regress in disguise. Making the chain circular doesn't remove the need for explanation, it only obscures it. If we say a causes B, B causes C, and C causes A, we have certainly drawn a neat closed curve, but we haven't actually explained why any of these entities exist or have the powers they do. The entire loop taken as a whole, still calls for a grounding explanation. To declare, it's a loop. Therefore, it has no external cause risks, treating the loop itself as a magic talisman that somehow generates existence from non-existence. But a cycle of causes is not self-explanatory merely by virtue of being circular. We can ask of the entire loop, why does this loop exist at all, instead of nothing or instead of some other configuration? The loop either has an answer to that or it doesn't. If it doesn't, then we've just pushed the brute fact problem up one level. The entire loop is now the brute fact. If it does have an answer, that answer will amount to a principle or condition outside the loop that makes the loop necessary, in which case the loop wasn't truly self-contained after all. Imagine 3 books that lie in a circle, each one propping up the next. While each book is supported by another, you wouldn't conclude that the books are levitating independently. The question, what holds them up, still rightly points out that the whole set of books needs support, perhaps a table underneath. Likewise, A because B, B because C because A is an explanatory gestalt that still requires a foundation. Without an external support, the loop is a case of circular reasoning. It provides the illusion of explanation, A because B, etc. But in reality, it explains nothing. It's a closed circle of dependency with no origin. To call such a loop self-caused is to commit a kind of logical sleight of hand. You assume the existence of the whole in order to explain the parts, and assume the parts to explain the whole, but never explain the origin of either. In technical terms, if the loop is considered contingent, that is, it didn't have to exist, and could have been otherwise, then it still begs for an explanation beyond itself. So we're back to regress, just one level up. If instead the loop is considered necessary, existing by a necessity of its own nature, then the necessity is really the fundamental explanation, not the looping structure. In that case, we might as well simplify and say there is a necessary foundation, which could manifest as a loop or otherwise, but the looping adds nothing to the explanation. In summary, causal loops do not evade the problem of infinite regress, they merely wrap the regress in a circle. The fundamental issue remains any contingent configuration, even a cyclical one, calls for an explanation of its existence. Without a further reason, the loop is arbitrary and ungrounded. With a further reason, we have introduced a necessary factor outside the loop. Either way, the loop alone cannot be the ultimate answer. We are still driven to acknowledge a self-sufficient principle that gives the loop, or any structure, reality. Thus, infinite causal or explanatory loops fare no better than infinite chains. A loop cannot literally cause itself from nothing. It must be sustained by something more fundamental. And that brings us back to a necessary being, or principle once again. The conclusion: causal loops are clever illustrations, but they do not eliminate the need for a final ground. They are, at best, a different way of picturing a system, and at worst, a means of hiding the problem in plain sight without solving it. 4.8.1 Why this is not just brute facts. It is natural to worry that existential logicism is merely smuggling in its own brute facts. If Lear says that explanatory chains must terminate in some self-grounded elements, doesn't that just repackage the problem as because that's how reality is? The crucial difference is that Lear does not posit arbitrary stopping points. It starts from what is already given by. The earlier pillars, that some occurrences obtain, epistemic refutation paradox, illusion of nothingness, that dependence relations can be made precise, and that regress structures are subject to logical constraints. Self-grounded elements are not free-floating add-ons, they are whatever must exist if those constraints are to be satisfied at all. In other words, Lear does not say here the chain ends just because it shows that if there is any stable explanatory structure, then there must be elements whose obtaining is not explained in the same way as the rest. That necessity is driven by the logic of dependence itself, not by an unexplained metaphysical posit. What Lear rules out are infinitely descending chains, not all further questions. Existential logicism concedes that perhaps explanations do have to stop somewhere, but it denies that the stopping point must be necessary or self-explanatory. According to this view, some things just exist inexplicably. They are brute facts. A brute fact is something that is true or exists without any reason or cause. It just is. This line of thought suggests that instead of eliminating infinite regress through a logical principle or necessary being, we could simply declare an arbitrary terminus. This exists for either no logical reason, or for some arbitrary reason it's just a brute fact, and that's the end of the explanation. For example, one might claim that the universe itself is a brute fact. It exists without cause or explanation, or similarly, a theist might claim God is a brute fact, eternal and without external explanation. In both cases, the response to why does this exist would be, it just does. Don't ask further. By invoking brute facts, one effectively attempts to stop the regress by fiat, not by reason. Is this move acceptable in philosophy or science? To accept brute facts is to perform an intellectual retreat rather than a resolution. It halts the regress, yes. but at the cost of abandoning the search for understanding. The moment we allow just because, as an answer, inquiry loses its power. Declaring something a brute fact is like closing the book on a mystery and saying no solution exists. It is. The antithesis of explanation. This approach not only feels unsatisfying, it is deeply problematic for the foundations of rational thought. If we permit one brute fact, what principle stops anything from being a brute fact? If certain features of reality need no explanation, then, in principle, we could use that excuse to shut down any further questioning about anything. Any inconvenient puzzle could be dismissed with, well, that's just how it is. This would collapse philosophy and science into arbitrariness. The scientific enterprise operates on the assumption that phenomena have explanations, that we can find reasons for why things are the way they are, rather than accepting them as random givens. Indeed, the principle of sufficient reason, going back to Leibniz 1989, holds that for anything that exists, there must be a reason why it is so and not otherwise. Brute facts explicitly violate this principle by saying here, there is no reason, as allowing even a single unexplained fact means the rule everything has a reason is broken. And if it's broken once, who's to say it won't break everywhere? The expectation of explanation would be undermined across the board. Accepting brute facts would thus inject a kind of chaos into our worldview. The universe would no longer be rationally ordered through and through, but an amalgam of some explainable parts and some inscrutable, just so patches. That undercuts the unity and predictability of reality. We observe, however, that reality does exhibit remarkable order, coherence, and lawfulness. To arbitrarily carve out an aspect of reality and say this part has no reason is inconsistent with the success of reason and science elsewhere. Beyond these epistemic issues, calling something a brute fact doesn't actually answer the question. It just refuses to answer. If someone asks, why does X exist? And we respond, it just does. End of story. We haven't provided understanding. We've halted the conversation. The problem of arbitrariness also looms large. Why that brute fact and not something else? If the universe just exists without reason, why this universe with these laws, rather than a completely different one, or none at all? To say no reason is to effectively say it's a random accident. But if reality were ultimately random and irrational at its foundation, it's hard to see why it would exhibit consistent logical structure, or any regularity. Yet it does. Invoking brute facts on a broad scale would make the success of scientific and logical reasoning a puzzling miracle. Even those who propose brute facts usually do so selectively. For example, only the Big Bang is brute. Everything after follows laws, or only God is brute. Everything else he explains. But selective arbitrariness is still arbitrariness. The only coherent way to terminate a regress is with something that by its nature needs no further explanation. That is, something necessary. A necessary fact or being is not brute in the arbitrary sense. It has a built-in reason for its existence. It cannot not exist. In contrast, a brute fact could conceivably be otherwise or not exist, but simply doesn't have an explanation for why it is so. Such brute contingency offers no solace to reason. It fails to answer the regress. It just puts up a sign saying stop. No explanation beyond this point. This goes against the grain of rational inquiry and even basic intellectual curiosity. In short, brute facts are an excuse to avoid the problem, not a solution to it. They undercut the very project of understanding the world. Therefore, we reject brute facts as a cop-out. The terminus of explanation must be something that explains itself by its very nature, something whose existence is anchored in necessity, not something that we arbitrarily declare to exist for no reason. Having dispatched these objections, we find that our original thesis stands. We are logically driven to a worldview in which infinite regress has no place. Neither infinite chains, nor closed loops, nor arbitrary brute facts can ultimately satisfy the demands of reason. The only viable option is a necessary foundation for reality. 4.9 Implications. The foundation of causal and epistemic structure. Acknowledging that infinite regress is impossible forces a radical but illuminating shift in how we understand reality, knowledge, and explanation. If no chain of explanation can be infinite, then some final stopping point exists, not as a matter of speculative metaphysics, but as a logical requirement. This has far-reaching consequences for both metaphysics, the study of what exists, and epistemology, the study of how we know. First and foremost, if reality does not permit an infinite causal history, then something exists necessarily. At the core of existence, there must lie a fundamental principle or entity that depends on nothing outside itself. This foundational reality is self-sufficient and non-contingent. In plainer terms, it doesn't wait on anything else to exist, it just is, and cannot be otherwise. All other things, all events, and all truths ultimately derive from this foundation. Crucially, this necessary basis cannot be an arbitrary posit. That would be the brute fact route we've ruled out. It must be there by its own nature, meaning that its non-existence is impossible. We might call it the ground of being or the first principle. Throughout history, various labels have been attached to this idea. God, Tao, logical law, fundamental energy, etc. But whatever it is called, it plays the role of ending the regress with coherence, rather than arbitrariness. Everything that exists or is true is anchored, in the final analysis, in this self-grounded reality. To deny the above is to collapse into incoherence. If one insisted, despite all, that there really is no final foundation, that explanations keep going in circles or forever, one would be asserting that nothing ever actually explains existence. The very fact we find ourselves in an ordered world with comprehensible patterns would be a miracle with no rationale. By contrast, accepting a necessary foundation restores intelligibility. It affirms that existence is not a brute accident, nor an infinite riddle with no answer, but a structured system grounded in a principle of reason. For example, one might think of the principle being exists, or logic, is true as necessarily and eternally the case. This aligns with a deep intuition behind all inquiry, that at the bottom of things there is a reason. Indeed, the absence of infinite regress vindicates a strong form of the principle of sufficient reason, that for everything that exists, there is a reason why it is so. Here, the ultimate reason is the nature of the necessary foundation itself. Metaphysically, this means any model of the universe or reality must be restructured to include a necessary element at the base. No cosmological model that relies on an endless sequence of events can be complete. It must account for what made the sequence possible. No theory of physics that posits an infinite regression of energy exchanges or expansions and contractions can be satisfactory without identifying a timeless law or entity that underpins the series. Similarly, in ontology, the study of being, one cannot hold that entities only exist because other entities cause them. In an unbroken regress, one must posit at least one entity that exists in virtue of itself. Whether we imagine the foundation to be a law of nature, a logical truth, a state of pure being, or a divine creator, the key attribute is the same. It does not derive its existence from something else. It just is by necessity. Future philosophical and scientific frameworks will be judged, in part, by whether they successfully incorporate this terminus. Any framework that continues to assume an open-ended regress of explanations isn't just incomplete, it is internally defeated by its inability to ever explain anything fully. Epistemologically, the implications are equally profound. It means that knowledge in principle has a secure foundation. Skeptical worries about needing proof for proof for proof, and so on, are answered by the recognition that some truths prove themselves. For example, the knowledge that I'm experiencing something might be such a foundational truth, it cannot be doubted without affirming it. If one is experiencing doubt, that's still an experience. More abstractly, the basic. Laws of logic, such as the law of non-contradiction, might be candidates for necessary truths. They are presupposed by any act of reasoning, including attempts to deny them. The end of infinite regress assures us that certainty is attainable in at least some domains. We don't slide into total relativism or nihilism, because there is a firm ground upon which the structure of thought rests. All inferential knowledge, knowledge that comes via evidence and reasoning, must trace back to non-inferential knowledge at the base, something known by its own light. Thus, our picture of knowledge becomes one of a pyramid, or an arch, many levels of beliefs and reasons, but ultimately supported by a few keystones that hold everything up by themselves. Recognizing this undermines extreme skepticism. Yes, we must be critical and demand reasons, but we also acknowledge when a reason is so fundamental that it needs no further support. If we did not, we would be forced to doubt everything and resolve nothing. Thankfully, the elimination of infinite regress means that reason can reach bedrock. We can have confidence that some principles, call them axioms, self-evident truths, or necessary facts, give validity to the whole structure of thought and language. Rational inquiry, then, is not an infinite pendulum never coming to rest. It is more like a finite voyage that, if pursued deeply enough, lands on the unshakable ground of necessity. Another implication concerns the nature of reality's structure. If reality must rest on a necessary foundation, it follows that reality is fundamentally ordered and deterministic in a broad sense. By deterministic here, we do not mean that every event is predetermined in a Laplacian clockwork sense, but rather that reality's basic framework is governed by law-like necessity rather than whim or chance. The existence of a necessary principle implies that many features of the world logically follow from, or are sustained by that principle. This rules out the idea of a fundamentally random or lawless cosmos. Even probabilistic and chaotic processes, like quantum events or weather patterns, occur against the backdrop of stable laws or conditions that make those very processes possible. The logical elimination of the infinite regress, Pillar 3, herence of the world is guaranteed by the necessary foundation. Things exist in a certain way because, if they didn't, nothing would make sense or could persist. In a way, this elevates reason itself to a cosmic role. The structure of reality is rational, or at least rationally understandable, at its core, because if it weren't, we'd devolve into the absurdities of infinite regress. Thus, we expect that whatever the fundamental principle is, it brings a unity and consistency to the cosmos. This is consonant with the success of physics and mathematics in describing the universe. Deep down, there are elegant equations and symmetries, hinting that the world emanates from something like a logical or mathematical necessity. It also resonates with philosophical rationalism, the view that reality is ultimately shaped by reason or intelligible principles. The elimination of infinite regress reinforces why reality cannot be an arbitrary assortment of phenomena. It must be a self-contained, logically integrated whole. Otherwise, it would fragment into disjointed facts hanging on nothing. Finally, we should consider the practical intellectual consequence for anyone modeling reality. We now have a sort of litmus test for theories. Does this theory ultimately ground out in something necessary, or does it leave an infinite regress? If the latter, the theory is incomplete or incoherent. For example, a theory in cosmology that posits oscillating universes forever must answer why this eternal cycle. A theory in mathematics that tries to define every concept in terms of more fundamental concepts endlessly will never produce a proof. In contrast, a theory that acknowledges a base, like the axioms of mathematics or a first law of physics, sets the stage for a solid structure. This doesn't mean we should readily accept any proposed foundation. We must rigorously evaluate what candidate could serve as a genuine self-sufficient principle. But it means we won't fear the idea of an ultimate explanation as unscientific or mystical. On the contrary, an ultimate explanation, a terminus of explanation, is demanded by logic. Even if that ultimate explanation is something currently beyond our imagination, we know it must exist. This opens the door to profound questions in metaphysics and theology. What is the nature of the necessary foundation? Is it a conscious intelligence? As some theistic philosophers argue, the ens, necessarium, or necessary being is, or an impersonal set of laws, as some naturalistic philosophers might claim, or perhaps something that transcends those categories. Those debates lie beyond our scope here, but they are the right kind of debates to have, ones that presume a terminus and seek to characterize it, as opposed to debates that try to avoid a terminus altogether. 4.10 Conclusion. In closing, the elimination of infinite regress is not a negotiable thesis, but a logical mandate. There is no escape from the fact that existence and knowledge require a foundation that stands on its own. Any attempt to explain the world by an endless deferral either results in contradiction, explains nothing, or implicitly smuggles in a hidden foundation, as we saw with loops and brute facts. To construct a meaningful, coherent picture of reality, we must abandon the fantasy that its explanation's all the way down, and recognize that at the heart of everything lies something irreducible, something that simply must be. This isn't a limitation of our imagination. It is a discovery about how reason operates and how being sustains itself. Causality and knowledge must be self-grounded at the root, not infinitely deferred. The very presence of any truth or any event is the proof that the buck stops somewhere. By eliminating infinite regress, we affirm that reality is intelligible and logically ordered. We affirm that contradictions can be resolved and that understanding can reach completion. This clarity comes at the cost of accepting a necessary core to reality, but it is not a cost so much as a revelation. It tells us that contingency and randomness do not have the final word. Necessity and coherence do. Infinite regress cannot stand. It destroys the very context needed for things to exist or be known. Necessity is unavoidable. Something has to exist by its own power for anything else to exist at all. Logical coherence demands a final grounding, and in finding it, we secure the possibility of knowledge, explanation, and existence itself. In sum, the refusal of infinite regress is the affirmation of intelligibility, a commitment that our search for answers does end in answers, and those answers, in turn, illuminate why there is an end at all. Reality, we conclude, is not an infinite question mark, but a well-founded structure, and that foundation is the ultimate answer to the riddle of why something, why anything at all. 4.1% Formal derivation. Lear logical elimination of infinite regress. This appendix states the logical elimination of infinite regress. Lear, in the same formal idiom used for ERP, trips prison, and ion. The goal is to show that, once we accept the earlier pillars, an all-the-way-down picture of explanation is not a live option. Any coherent model of reality compatible with existential logicism must include some self-grounding structure. A. Background, occurrences, reality, and prior pillars. We continue to use the basic vocabulary from the ERP and ion appendices. Definition 4.1 Reality and occurrences. Let R be a non-empty domain of occurrences. We write OCC, X for X is an occurrence in reality. Thus, XOCC, XXR, intuitively, occurrences are whatever it is that happens or obtains in reality, events, states, facts, configurations, etc. We presuppose the following results from earlier pillars, here treated as background theorems. ERP, trips prison, minimal realism. For any epistemic agent, A who tokens any substantive state S, including radical skeptical denials, there exists at least one occurrence. Formally, for any such A and S, TOCA S, X, OCC, X, in particular, a global denial of occurrences cannot be coherently tokened. Ion, no absolute nothingness. There is no possible world W in which reality is empty. In modal notation, X, OCC, X, that is, there is at least one occurrence is necessary. Absolute nothingness is not a genuine metaphysical option. PPP. Present principle, informally, explanatory and causal structure, must be realized in the present at any given present. What actually grounds what is not an unrealized limit, but an actually instantiated structure. An explanation that would only complete a never arrived at infinite tale is not a true explanation of anything now. Lear is the claim that given this background, reality cannot be exhausted by an infinite regress of purely dependent occurrences. There must be some self-grounding structure, be dependence and regress. We now introduce a general dependence relation. This is deliberately abstract, so it can be read as causal, existential, or justificatory dependence, depending on context. Definition 422, dependence relation. Let dp, xy, be a binary relation on R, with the intended reading x depends, in the relevant sense, on y. We assume D1, typeness, DEP, Y, OCC, irreflexivity, X, nothing depends on itself in the primitive sense. Think of DEP as covering any of the following. X is caused by Y, X is grounded in Y, X is justified by Y, etc. Layer applies to any such dependence that is supposed to fully explain the relevant X definition 4.3. Dependence chains and regress. A dependence chain for an occurrence x0 is a finite or countably infinite sequence, axis the second of occurrences with x0 as its first element, and I. 0 DEP, Shi1, Shi. We say, in is an infinite regress chain if I equal to n, and DEP, Shi1, Shi, holds for all I greater than 0. Thus an infinite regress chain is a one-way infinite sequence, where each link depends on a further distinct link, with no minimal, non-dependent member in that mode. Definition 4.4. Self-grounded and purely dependent occurrences. Given a dependence relation dep, an occurrence f is self-grounded, WRT dep, if. OCC, f dep, fy. That is, f does not depend on any further occurrence in that mode. An occurrence x is purely dependent, WRT dep, if OCC, x, y dep, xy. Note that self-grounded here is structural. It says nothing about content besides non-dependence in the relevant sense. Lear's point is that some such structure must exist. It does not presuppose a particular metaphysical story, for example, theism, vacuum laws, etc. C. Why brute nothing, and pure loops cannot ground reality. First, we exclude two obvious, but inadequate, candidates for foundations of a regress, termination in nothingness, and explanatory loops. Lemma 4.1. No termination in nothingness. Let xe the second be any dependence chain, as in definition 4.3. Then, no terminal point of the chain can be absolute nothingness. That is, there is no I such that G is, or corresponds to, nothing in the sense ruled out by ion. Proof. By D1, every she in the chain satisfies OCC, she. But ion tells us that absolute nothingness is precisely the absence of all occurrences. That is a state in which X or CCX holds. Hence, there is no element of R which both is an occurrence and is absolute nothingness. So the chain cannot bottom out in a member that is literally nothing. Any purported explanation that appeals to a terminal nothing is therefore incoherent in the existential logicism sense. Lemma 4.2. Loops do not provide foundations. Suppose there is a finite cycle x0, xn of occurrences such that DEP, she plus 1 for 0 less than or equal to in, and DEP xn, x0, then this cycle cannot by itself provide a non-regressive explanation of any of its members. Proof. Take any xk in the loop. By assumption, xk depends via some finite chain of dp links on each other member of the loop, and each of those members depends back on xk, again via a finite chain. So the explanantia for xk are all themselves explained only by occurrences that ultimately rely on xk. In other words, the entire cycle is collectively unsupported by anything outside itself. If we ask what ultimately grounds the existence of this loop, the answer the loop itself is circular. It fails to provide a non-regressive ground. So a loop may redistribute dependence but does not eliminate it. The demand for a non-circular ground is left unsatisfied. Thus, neither it ends in nothing, nor it goes in a circle can serve as a genuine foundation for dependence. D. Infinite regress, an incomplete explanation. The remaining regress option is a genuinely infinite descent with no minimal self-grounded member and no loop. Lear's central claim is that, given the earlier pillars, this cannot yield a complete explanation of reality, and thus cannot be the whole story. We make explicit what complete explanation means in the existential logicism sense. Definition 4.5. Complete dependence explanation. Let XR be a non-empty set of occurrences, and let DEP be a dependence relation. A complete dependence explanation of X, WRT DEP, is a structure, F DP, such that E1, FR, and F is non-empty. E2. Every XX is connected to at least one FF via a finite dependence chain. XXFFN less than omega X1. XNR X0 equal to X, XN plus 1 equal to F. I less than or equal to NDEP, Shi G plus 1. E3. Each FF is self-grounded in the relevant mode, that is OCC, F, and EDIP, F, Y. Intuitively, X is fully explained by DEP just in case every member of X traces, via a finite dependence chain, to some self-grounded member of F. Infinite regress, on its own, is the situation where E2 is attempted with F equal to, and every member is purely dependent with no F as in E3. Lemma 4.3. Infinite regress never reaches a foundation. Suppose that for all XR there exists Y with DEP, XY, and that there are no self-grounded occurrences, that is no F with OCC, F, dip FY. Then no set XR admits a complete dependence explanation in the sense of definition 4.5. Proof. Assume for contradiction that some non-empty X has a complete explanation via FDEP. By E1, F is non-empty, and by E3, each FF is self-grounded. But this contradicts the global assumption that there are no self-grounded occurrences. So no such F can exist. Hence, there is no complete dependence explanation for any non-empty X under the hypothesis that every occurrence is purely dependent and no self-grounded element exists. Thus, if we demand complete explanation rather than a forever unfinished chain, infinite regress is structurally inadequate. It never reaches anything that could count as a foundation in the existential logicism sense. Ilaire. Reality cannot be all the way down. We can now state Lear explicitly. Theorem 4.4, Lear. Logical elimination of infinite regress. Assume a 1, minimal realism, ion. Reality is necessarily non-empty, XOCC, X a 2, present realization, PPE. Any dependence structure that purports to explain what obtains now must be fully realized in the present. Explanations that would only be completed by an actually unrealized infinite tail do not count as complete explanations of the present. A 3. No circular foundations. Loops and termination in absolute nothingness cannot provide a non-regressive ground. Lemmas 4.1 and 4.2. A 4. Demand for complete explanation. For the relevant target, set XR, for example, all present occurrences, or the obtaining of reality as such. A complete dependence explanation, in the sense of definition 4.5, is required for the explanatory project, not to collapse into brute arbitrariness. Then it follows that, C1. It is impossible that every occurrence in X be purely dependent, with no self-grounded occurrences at all. C2. There must exist at least one self-grounded occurrence F, in the relevant mode, such that every XX is connected to some such F by a finite dependence chain. In other words, reality cannot be exhausted by an infinite regress of dependence. Some self-grounding structure is logically forced. Proof. Suppose, for contradiction, that every occurrence in X is purely dependent, and that there are no self-grounded occurrences anywhere in R. By lemma 4.3, no non-empty XR can then have a complete dependence explanation. This contradicts a 4, which demands such an explanation for the relevant X on pain of explanatory collapse. Next, could one attempt to rescue completeness by allowing either termination at absolute nothingness or circular dependence? Termination at absolute nothingness is ruled out by ion and lemma 4.1. Circularity is ruled out as an acceptable foundation by lemma 4.2. Thus, the only way to satisfy a 4 under a 1, a 3, is to admit at least one self-grounded occurrence F, as in definition 4.4, and to require that all members of X be connected to such F via finite dependence chains, as in E2. Hence, C1 and C2 follow. Pure infinite regress without any self-grounding structure is logically incompatible with the existential logicism background, and a self-grounding reality, or realities, is forced. F remarks and corollaries. Corollary 4.6. Self-grounded reality is not a brute stop. The self-grounded structure required by Lear is not a merely stipulative last turtle chosen by taste. It is what remains once absolute nothingness is excluded as an option ion. E. Purely circular dependence is rejected as non-foundational, and E. Infinitely deferred dependence is rejected as incomplete explanation in light of PP, and a 4, thus existential logicism, does not posit a brute fact. It derives the necessity of some self-grounding structure by elimination of all coherent alternatives. Corollary 4.7. No regress into a void. Given ion and Lear, no explanatory chain can terminate in a metaphysical void. Every successful explanation must either terminate in self-grounded structure within reality, or be recognized as incomplete, and thus not a genuine all-the-way-down theory. The popular picture turtles all the way down, and then nothing is not a coherent description of reality on existential logicism grounds. Remark 4.8. Mode neutrality and application. Because DEP is abstract, Lear applies across modes. Epistemic, ERP, already gives self-justifying experiential foundations. Certain occurrences need no further epistemic ground. Causal. Temporal, PP plus layer, rules out a present state, whose causal story consists only of an unrealized infinite tale. Some present structure must be causally self-sustaining in the relevant sense. Existential, ontological, ion plus layer, says that being as such is necessary and self-grounded. Reality does not hang from something beyond itself. Thus layer is not a separate dogma, layered on top of the earlier pillars. It is the global shape they jointly force on any coherent model of reality. Remark 4.9, finite moments, unbounded history. Layer does not claim that there must be a first temporal moment or a finite number of changes. It only claims that, at any given present, the dependence structure that actually explains what is happening is well-founded in the sense of definition 4.5, and the existence of reality as such is self-grounded rather than deferred to anything beyond reality. In this way, existential logicism allows unbounded variation and change, while denying that reality's existence or present obtaining could be structured as a pure infinite regress. Chapter 5. Persistent present determinism, Pillar